On this week's Prequel episode, we follow up on our Three Musketeers listener polls and preview Philip Van Dorn Stern's The Greatest Gift and its film adaptation, It's a Wonderful Life. Hello and welcome back to another episode of This Film is Lit. Prequel episode of This Film is Lit. We're talking about movies that are based on books. I have so many notes in the movie section that we don't even have a learning things segment this week.
Yeah.
I started finding notes and everything was just really interesting, so I just kept putting stuff, and I was like, I have to stop eventually. Like 4 pages of movie notes. So we don't have a learning things segment, but we're just going to get right into it because we still have a ton of stuff to talk about. Let's get into it with our patron shoutouts.
I put up with you because your father and mother were our finest patrons, that's why.
No new patrons this week, but we do have our Academy Award winners, and they are Matilde, Steve from Arizona, Paul, Kat Insminger, Jeff Niederhofer, Teresa Schwartz, Ian from Wine Country, Winchester's Forever, Kelly Napier, Gray Hightower, Eli Young, Scratch, Just Scratch. Shelby says, all I want for Christmas is TFIL merch. That Darn Skag, V Frank, and Alina Starkov. Thank you all very much. Appreciate you all. Shelby, sorry we don't have merch. I can't promise anything. I will say this. We have discussed, and this may be a thing in the new year that we pursue with more veracity, doing a slight redesign on...
Yeah, just a more interesting logo.
Yeah, I designed that original logo in a matter of a couple hours, and I am no designer. I can get by, but I am hardly a designer, but we know quite a few. And we've been discussing having some of our branding stuff kind of reworked, and if we do that, when we do that, that would be a time that we would potentially do some TFIL merch, and maybe we could have a throwback if you wanted the original logo. But the goal would be that we're gonna get a more interesting, visually interesting logo that would make for better merch. So hold out, and hopefully one day here soon that will come true. All right, Katie, let's find out what people had to say about the Three Musketeers.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
On Patreon, we had 0 votes for the book, which surprised me. 3 for the movie, and then 2 listeners who couldn't decide. Steve from Arizona said, I will always love and support this stupid movie, regardless of what people think of me or how I comport myself when it comes to my snooty modern film takes. This version is obviously the best version to come out in decades. It's fun as hell, has a tremendous cast with the exception of Chris O'Donnell, and is simple and convoluted enough for multiple generations to enjoy. This is one of the few movies I watched in a theater growing up, considering I was part of a large Catholic family where video rental nights were the norm and having to watch kids' movies was typical. So yeah, Bottas's silly action and goofy humor really pleased me as I drank a movie theater soda with red vines and my own bag of popcorn. Nostalgia clouds the mind, but this is good nostalgia in my opinion. Plus, watching 3 women I still think are gorgeous in Rebecca De Mornay, Julie Delpy, and Gabrielle Anwar still proves 13-year-old me has good taste in women. I will admit I have seen other versions of Dumas' work in the 2001 John Woo-inspired atrocity that was Musketeer, as well as the 2023 trailer for the film, which looks like they shot the dang film with 50% aperture on the lens. This version will always hold a place in my heart. It represented a sillier, more fun time of filmmaking before the ultra-serious 90s took over. I liked most of the actors in the film, and I'm still perplexed by the fact Oliver Platt didn't become a bigger name. He literally stole every scene he was in. And even though I'm a pretentious metalhead/music snob, I love All for Love. What a perfect amalgamation of the 80s and 90s wedding song scene.
That is very, All for
That's
Love is
a good description of that song.
80s, 90s wedding ballad for sure. I know I dumped on Chris O'Donnell a little bit. I thought he was fine. Rewatching it, I thought he was fine in this movie. Not amazing or anything.
He does what he needs to do.
He does what he needs to do. I thought he was serviceable. Again, somebody else maybe would have been better for sure. I didn't particularly like, again, he was probably the weakest of maybe Charlie Sheen, I would argue. Is
Well,
like
Charlie Sheen, I think
his
the
character is
problem
also-
the problem with Charlie Sheen is that now he's just kind of a distraction.
Yeah.
Like he's just Charlie Sheen
Right.
randomly in a Three Musketeers movie,
Right.
whereas watching it
At the time,
it
Which,
maybe
yeah, I
wouldn't
mean,
have
at
been
the
that
time-
big of a deal.
Yeah, when I saw it at the time as a kid, I enjoyed this movie when I was younger. So yeah, I get that. That being said, I don't think he's particularly doing anything interesting.
Yeah.
Like again, but also his character's kind of the least interesting. But that being said, like I said, I thought Chris O'Donnell was fine. Like I didn't think it was just like bad, particularly bad, like he is in maybe like some of the Batman movies and stuff where you're just like, ugh. But those movies are just bad in general. A couple things. I thought the trailer for the 2023 film looks great. I get that it's a little dark, but modern cinematography has changed. Where I don't think it's that dark. I mean, it's definitely darker than this movie, but they're also doing a much more serious take on. At least the trailer is much darker than this movie is. But it's not a lighthearted kids action romp. It is a more serious, dramatic film, which again maybe doesn't necessarily mesh with what the original book is from the sounds of what you said, with it being a little bit more of a silly, satirical
it's
kind
silly
of
and
thing.
fun.
But anyways, I still think it looks really good and interesting, and that whatever. I will say obviously there are trends, and I think I get what you're saying when you said it represented a sillier, more fun time of filmmaking before the ultra serious 90s took over. I guess I get what, like, again, I guess I kind of, there's definitely a cynicism and a cynicism to the 90s that I think is more apparent in maybe television than film, but all across media. There was a cynicism in the 90s that definitely kind of colored a lot of stuff. That being said, there's still plenty of, and I guess this is a problem I always have with kind of sweeping statements like that, is just like there's plenty of like goofy, weird, silly movies in the 90s, like tons of them. I don't like, there's like George of the Jungle, like with Brendan Fraser, came out in like 97 or something like that, I think. Obviously The Mummy came out in, I think it was like 99. So, right at the end. But there's all kinds of movies that are very similar to this that came out. But that being said, I think I get what you're saying, that there's a wider, overall, the 90s had a more cynical kind of take on the direction of film. I would agree that it is kind of perplexing that Oliver Platt didn't get bigger. That he's been in lots of stuff. It's not like he's not, a big actor, but he never blew up in the way that you might expect, because again, he steals every scene that he's in this movie. Like you said. And yeah, I think that was all the things. I don't know if I've ever seen the John Woo version. It sounds familiar once you mentioned it, but I can't recall. I cannot recall if I've ever seen it.
I've definitely never seen it. So
anyways. But yeah, no, it kind of sounds a little bit like, to you, this movie is what The Mummy was to me, or to, that it hit you right in that perfect age range where it was very formative, and you love it because of it.
And that's okay. I mean, nostalgia is a perfectly valid reason to love a movie and to prefer a movie to a book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our next comment was from Bridget of Hestia, who said, "My love of classics conflicts with my love of that particular brand of 90s film where every actor seems to be encouraged to chew on the scenery just a little as a treat. Can't decide."
That's fair. Yeah, because you're not wrong. Everybody is just doing whatever they want.
The actors can chew the scenery a little as a treat.
Yeah.
Charlene said, "I didn't rewatch this recently, so my memories are from a time when silly fun was all I really needed to enjoy a movie. Also, I have so much nostalgic fondness for All for Love."
Yes.
And if I recall correctly, the whole incorporate the end credits ballad into the score thing is something else they borrowed from The Princess Bride.
I would have to think back to what the... Well, to be fair, I also don't know what direction this went.
That's
it's
true.
very possible that they did the score and then they gave it to Bryan Adams and said, "Here, turn this into a pop song." Yeah. You know what I mean? I don't actually
that
know.
Could also be the same for The Princess Bride.
Yeah, that's what
The Princess Bride's main theme does recur throughout the score. The storybook love.
Oh, yes, you're right. Yeah.
But I don't know which way that
I'm not
went.
sure which direction that went. I would imagine.
I would think the score first.
You would think, but it's very possible not. I don't know. It's actually really interesting. I'm going to do some looking and see if we can figure out which way that went. And it may not always go the same direction. Like,
True.
Sometimes it may be like, hey, Bryan Adams, write us a pop song, and they use it for the score. Other times it may be, here's the score, turn this into take something from it, turn it into a pop song. I don't know.
But yeah, definitely something else that is reminiscent of The Princess Bride.
Yeah.
And our last comment.
I will say it's very funny though, because The Princess Bride, the storybook love song, is not one that I ever think about. The score, yes, but the lyric version never enters my brain.
I love that song.
I'm not saying I don't like it. As soon as you said it, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. I do like that, but it's not compared to All for Like. I remember listening to All for Love like I had it on a CD or something when I was a kid, like it was on a or whatever. So like that is just different to me. Like I didn't have Storybook Love or whatever it was called. I never listened to that outside of the context of the film, where I did listen to All for Love outside of the context of the film. So.
All right, our last comment on Patreon was from Matilde, who said, "My heart says choose the movie. My head is set on the book, so I can't decide."
More movie love than I was expecting.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
The movie is, and I should have mentioned this in my final verdict, the movie is far more accessible.
Oh, yeah.
Than the book.
Yeah.
Like,
and I mean, it's a Disney film.
By a long shot.
It's a Disney film from the early 90s, and our audience is in that age range where, they're our age, roughly.
You
some
probably
older, some younger.
watched it as a kid.
So, yeah, you watched it, like, similar to me. You probably watched it, when you were young and in a formative age. So, I guess it shouldn't have surprised me that so many people. I think the thing that surprised me is that, for me, it was one of those things where I forgot about it. Until you literally mentioned that we were doing it. And I was like, oh, yeah, I've seen this movie a lot when I was little. It was just one of those movies where it just wasn't in my brain anymore. And so I guess I was a little surprised that so many people have that fondness for the movie. But it shouldn't have surprised me because, again, on rewatching it and from my memory, I was like, oh, yeah, I liked this a lot as a kid. Yeah.
Matilda went on to say, rereading the 900 pages, everything takes more words to be said in French. That is true.
Yeah.
As an adult, made me appreciate Dumas' style more than I did as a kid. The book might have some pacing issues, but it's almost never boring or tedious, and the dialogue is delicious. It's so French it hurts, with all the wine and the womanizing and the chauvinism, but at least it's not heavy like Victor Hugo. The characters really make it work. Milady is especially fascinating to read. I love an unrepentant and merciless villain. But I did have more problems with our heroes this time around. It's funny that what seems to have remained in from the Musketeers in general culture is honor and virtue when there is little examples of those qualities in the text. They're greedy, quick to anger, or hypocritical, and while I love flawed protagonists, I don't think they are perceived as such now, as they should. I think the movie is a lot of harmless fun, with an impeccable cast. Yes, even Chris O'Donnell, he plays the dumbass like no other. And of course, fantastic music. There was potential for an objectively better movie. The scenes between Athos and Milady in particular tell me as much. It probably would have made an excellent movie if it hadn't had to be Disneyified. I would have liked to see the original script with the same cast and crew, done with more freedom and a bigger budget. I bet it'd be a classic then and not just a guilty pleasure. The upcoming adaptation will be a two-part, one focusing on D'Artagnan and the second one on Milady, which, by the way, kind of follows the
Is that
book.
how the book?
Yeah,
Oh.
the second half. I mean, D'Artagnan is still like the main character, but
Right.
the second half is much more focused
Interesting.
on Milady. We might finally have a movie that will take into account the chapters from her perspective and a deeper exploration of her character. That being said, it looks like it will be another gritty and serious action movie. Why do they insist on removing all the fun and levity from the original story, which is the best part? Until they make the Muppet Musketeers, which will inevitably be the best version, like the Muppet Christmas Carol, I'll maintain that the 93 movie is the closest to the book, at least in spirit and energy, if not in execution.
Wow. There you go.
Yeah, that's a pretty good assessment.
A
I think.
a lot of it fell in line with a lot of stuff you said,
Yeah.
During the course of the episode. And I did just double check. It is Ava Green that is playing Milady the Winter, which
interesting.
I
Yeah.
am here for. Big Ava Green fan. But yeah, I and then the D'Artagnan is somebody I've never heard of, a French actor named Francois Civil.
Yeah.
So.
And I think what is interesting about trying to adapt this book is that it kind of falls into a space which doesn't really exist in modern media anymore, which is like fun, light-hearted, like actiony romp that is also adult material. Because like the closest thing that I can think of is like a straight up comedy, but it's not a comedy.
Yeah. I was trying to think of other like potential modern examples that would fall into that.
Because I think the reason that a lot of people want to adapt it as
like a comedy,
as well as like a kid's movie or whatever, is because it is so like it's silly and it's fun and it's got like people doing sword fights and like stuff that we as like a modern audience would typically associate with a kid's movie.
Or at least, like a younger audience.
But then you have to completely change the story because the actual story is quite adult.
Yeah, and about like political intrigue.
And like affairs and womanizing and getting drunk.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if there is I mean, I'm sure there is. I'm just blanking on it. I'm sure I'll think of one later, but
it's kind of a space that we don't really tell stories in anymore, I feel like.
I guess I feel like I'm not saying I disagree. I feel like that we do. I feel like we do, and there are examples of it. Maybe it's arguably less common, but I don't know. I will say I can't think of any straight up like obvious examples off the top of my head. I mean, I think you could argue The Princess Bride kind of does that.
Yeah, I think the closest.
I mean, The Princess Bride is about like murdering his wife to start a war with another.
I was going to say, I think the closest thing is like the action adventure comedy.
Yeah,
but again, we're not really making those anymore.
They're not well. I mean, they've been replaced by Marvel films, or superhero films, which I would argue some of them have some, not all of them by any stretch, not even most of them probably, but there are some that have heavier, elements that would be similar, but it's definitely different. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, something to think about. But yeah.
All right. Over on Facebook, we had 2 votes for the book and 2 for the movie. Adam said, "I've got to give it to the book. Dumas' writing is great in a quippy 19th century pop culture way. I also appreciate its adult-targeted story and how aggressively French it is, which none of the adaptations seem to capture since they tend to bend so hard towards a complete rewrite for younger audiences. Although I'm always glad to lose the casual racism that often comes with old books. Movie versions of The Three Musketeers getting targeted at kids never made sense to me any more than if they decided to make a kid's version of The Count of Monte Cristo." Yeah, it's like when you look at it at surface level, it doesn't really make sense to keep adapting this one for kids.
Yeah.
I'm like, sure.
Yeah.
But
I mean, so this is not a kid's movie, I guess. But I had one pop into my head that it's not a kid's movie by any stretch. It's rated R, and lots of the humor and stuff in it is very much mature. But it is like a fun, silly movie that has very heavy themes that I would kind of is an action adventure mixed with salsa sci-fi, which is Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yeah.
And now, obviously, that's very different than...
Yeah.
It's not as wide of an audience film, for sure. It's not like, you're not taking your 10-year-old or whatever to go see that film. But, I don't know. I'm just always very hesitant to be like, we don't make movies like that anymore, because there's just... I always find that that's not true. Like, that's always not true. I'm not saying
that it's an absolute statement that we do not make movies like that anymore. I'm saying that it does not seem to be a common thing Like, it doesn't seem to be a common way that we tell stories right now.
Yeah, okay.
And I would
That's fair.
And I would say that Everything Everywhere All at Once, part of the reason that it got a lot of attention was because it felt like it was breaking the mold of the way that we're telling stories right now.
No, and that yeah, that's totally fair. That's totally true.
Andy said, growing up a Gen X kid in the UK, The Three Musketeers was a big cultural staple. The Richard Lester films were hugely popular, with the most stacked cast imaginable at the time, and Dumas was a mainstay on reading lists. The novel is actually frustrating to me. The over-present narrator just can't get out of the way of the great story, but I vote for the book because the 90s films feels so lazy to me. Where the novel's best moments have the Musketeers arriving at sweeping historical moments like the siege, the film can be best summed up by Paul McGann shouting, D'Artagnan! in his high-pitched fop voice. Bah humbug. Merry Christmas, everyone.
That's fair.
I gave it my best shot.
Did you know that guy, Paul McGann? So I didn't mention this in the episode or the prequel, but I was aware of it. I just didn't bring it up. But Paul McGann was the 8th Doctor.
Was he?
Yeah.
That's classic Doctor Who, right?
Well, I think it's like a weird. He was in. I think it was just like a one-off film from the 80s.
Because I've never watched.
That was like the
Who.
last gasp before. It wasn't like I don't think he was part of the TV series from Classic Who. I think it was like a TV movie that they made in like the 80s or 90s. It might have been the 90s. And it was like the last thing Doctor Who before
it got like rebooted.
The last TV show / movie, there might have been like, radio plays and stuff. But the last official like BBC TV or movie before New Who in 2005 or whatever. But yeah, he was the 8th Doctor. So.
Interesting. Our last comment on Facebook was from Crystal, who said, hard to pick. Everything in me knows that the book is technically better than the movie. I read it once for school and had no desire to reread it for this. It's 700 pages.
Yeah.
I cannot
Was that
blame
the only
you.
thing you read all semester? Like, that's such a large book to assign for a class, I feel like. But
the movie, on the other hand, is a nostalgic favorite that I love to rewatch, flaws and all. By the way, I would pay all the money to see the cast of What We Do in the Shadows do a remake of this movie.
I'm glad everyone agrees. That or the Muppets. That and the Muppets.
Yeah. On Twitter, we had 4 votes for the book, 1 for the movie, and 3 listeners who couldn't decide. And our only comment was from Kelly Napier, who said, I didn't rewatch the movie. I saw it forever ago in the theaters, and I've never read the book. I'm only here to endorse a Muppet version of this book. Kermit, Fozzie, and Rolf, with Gonzo as D'Artagnan.
There you go.
And I think that's perfect, honestly.
Yeah, for the Musketeers themselves. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Kermit, Athos, obviously.
be,
And then like the romantic backstory with Miss Piggy as Milady makes a lot of sense.
Makes perfect sense.
Fozzie, Porthos, clearly. Rolf, Aramis.
Yeah.
It all works.
It all works.
Over on Instagram, we had 6 votes for the book, 3 for the movie, and 1 undecided vote. An Anal Fracture 42 said, I did not read the book. However, I didn't like the movie that much. So it's a draw for me.
Fair enough. Like I said, I enjoy the movie, but it's not like great. It's not like, compared to something like The Mummy or Princess Bride.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed watching it. It was fun. But I do think that in order to enjoy it to the point of like the way that some other people seem to have enjoyed it, I need to have that nostalgia. Yeah. Like I needed to have seen it as a child.
And I even had some of that nostalgia, and I still, and I'm not saying other people would put it on that same level, but comparing it to something like The Mummy, The Princess Bride, or even Pirates of the Caribbean: Curse of the Black Pearl, the first one, I don't think it's anywhere near the same tier.
Yeah, it's not as memorable.
As being as memorable, as fun, as just like bombastic as all of those.
Yeah.
It's just not quite on the same level in a way that I think it's like on a lower tier, while still being enjoyable, like I said. And I came to it with some of that nostalgia. But yeah. So I get if you don't have any of that nostalgia being like, nah, that's fine. Yeah.
All right, so our listener poll's winner was the book. with 12 votes to the movie's 9, plus 6 listeners who couldn't decide, which might be our most undecided listeners ever.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Or at least proportionally.
Yeah.
Maybe not raw numbers, but yeah, proportionally, I think probably fairly close because that's a pretty even split across the board, honestly. With the book edging out a narrow victory. Speaking of books, we're going to learn a little bit about The Greatest Gift.
Well, who are you? I told you, George, I'm your guardian angel.
What is it you want, Barry? You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down.
Welcome home, Mr. Bailey.
Sentimental hogwash.
I wish I had $1 million.
All right, I just have a couple things here. There's not a ton of fun facts about this one.
Don't worry, I'm making up for it.
The Greatest Gift is a 1943 short story written by American writer, editor, and Civil War historian Philip Van Doren Stern, who's got a hell of a name.
I was going to say, when I read it earlier in the intro, I was like, that's a great name. Philip Van
fantastic
Doren
name.
Stern. Anybody with 4 names,
According to the Wikipedia article, he loosely based it on A Christmas Carol.
I mean, yeah, that
seems
obvious.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet, so I'm curious to read it and see what I think exactly is getting picked up there. I mean, I know the themes obviously, but
I mean, the general structure of man gets shown a world where he at Christmas time gets shown a world where he's not, things go different seems like by supernatural forces feels like
sure
kind of
I'm just saying I am interested to see.
I agree. I don't know if there's more specific places where it correlates, but I can see how you would compare it generally.
Right. So Stern finished his 4,100 word short story in 1943. He had been working on it since November of 1939. Which
1,000 words a year.
That's
obviously that's not how it works.
You know what? Relatable content. Unable to find a publisher, also relatable content. He sent 200 copies that he had printed as a 21-page booklet to his friends as Christmas presents in 1943. And I'm sure they all loved
I'm sure
it.
they were psyched. Great. Oh, Philip sent us his manuscript for Christmas. Great. Oh, you want notes on it? Cool. Thanks.
I hope some of his friends were also writers. Anyway, so the story was then published as a book in December of 1944 with illustrations by Raffaello Busoni.
Mm-hmm.
Stern also sold it to Reader's Scope magazine, which published the story in its December 1944 issue, and to the magazine Good Housekeeping, which published it under the title The Man Who Was Never Born in its January 1945 issue. So it's appeared in a couple different places. So according to the American Film Institute and Turner Classic Movies, Stern did not copyright the story until 1945, which is when he sold the film rights. And I'm guessing that you probably have more notes about this later.
This becomes a thing.
Yeah. And he then renewed that copyright in 1971, the 28th year after the publication of the original December 1943 booklets.
Yeah.
And
then, we will get to the film rights here in a little bit. So, that's all we got about The Greatest Gift. It's time now to learn a little bit more about It's a Wonderful Life.
Mr. and Mrs. Martini, welcome home.
This is what I wished for.
You see, George, you really had a wonderful life.
Merry Christmas!
It's a Wonderful Life is a 1946 film directed by Frank Capra, known for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, You Can't Take It With You, Lost Horizon, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, It Happened One Night, and Lady for a Day, among many others. It was written by married couple Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett, known for, they pretty much wrote together, from what I could find, almost exclusively wrote together on projects, known for The Thin Man, Easter Parade, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, the film adaptation, I assume. Father of the Bride, the original. So there's one in with Steve Martin in like the 90s, which they're credited on because it's a remake. But there was original in like the 50s. Yeah.
Okay.
The Diary of Anne Frank TV play, or there was they wrote the stage play of The Diary of Anne Frank, adapted it, and then there was also a TV film made from that stage play.
Interesting.
And then that is not an exhaustive list, but pretty prolific in the 50s and 40s and 50s in that era. The film stars James Stewart, Donna Reed, Lionel Barrymore, great uncle of Drew Barrymore, of the infamous or the famous Barrymore acting film. They're all actors forever.
Yeah, she comes from like a dynasty of acting.
And Lionel, I believe I read, was her great uncle or something like that. An uncle of some manner. Removed quite a bit. Thomas Mitchell, Henry Travers, Beulah Bondi, Ward Bond, Frank Phelan, and Gloria Graham.
I believe that's pronounced Beulah.
Beulah Bondi. There you go.
It's an old name.
Yes.
Not common anymore.
No. The film has a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes, an 89 out of 100 on Metacritic, and an 8.6 out of 10 on IMDb, which puts it at number 21 on their top films list. The film was nominated for 5 Oscars, including for Best Picture, Best Actor for James Stewart, Best Director for Frank Capra, Best Sound, and Best Editing. Did not win any of them, but it did win the Golden Globe for Best Director. The film initially opened to mixed reviews and was not a hit. In fact, it was quite a dud, making $3.3 million against a budget of $3.18 million. And I had read in a part later, and I don't think I included the specific note, that one of the reports was said that it actually lost money at the box office. So I don't know exactly where this was like on the little sidebar in Wikipedia where it says budget box office, but later it said it like lost $500,000. So I don't know. And
real quick.
Yes.
I just wanted to look up, since you said it was nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars, I wanted to look up what won that year. And apparently it was The Lost Weekend.
Yeah.
Which I've never heard of. So I guess this one got the last laugh.
Yes.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Go on.
And later we'll explore why this film became such a classic. Spoilers, it involves complicated copyright laws, which we alluded to just a few minutes ago in the book facts. Initially, The Greatest Gift came to the attention of either Cary Grant or RKO producer David Hempstead, who then one of the two showed it to Cary Grant's agent. Again, this is according to Wikipedia. And then in April 1944, RKO bought the rights for $10,000, hoping that Cary Grant would star in it, and it would be like a big Cary Grant vehicle, basically. Tons of people worked on drafts of scripts for this film, including Dalton Trumbo, Clifford Odets, and Mark Connolly, before RKO eventually shelved the project. In Dalton Trumbo's draft, George Bailey is an idealistic politician who grows more cynical as the story progresses and then tries to commit suicide after losing an election. The Angel shows him Bedford Falls not as it would be if he had never been born, but if he had gone into business instead of politics. Dalton Trumbo is also a very interesting guy. He's there's a whole movie about him starring I can't remember his name now, the guy who died who was in Hunger Games.
Philip Seymour Hoffman?
Yes, or Paul Giamatti. One of the two. I always get them confused. One of those two started in a biopic about Trumbo, who was, I think I have a note about it later.
He's also got a hell of a name.
The film actually starred Bryan Cranston. I'm not sure where I got Paul Giamatti or Philip Seymour Hoffman from, but it definitely starred Bryan Cranston. So, whoops. Do I have a note about? I'm trying to remember. I have a note about Trumbo later. But he was one of the people, or if I just didn't include it and was just like, I'll remember to talk about this, because I do that a lot of times where I won't include a note, but I'll just remember, and then I'm like, wait, did I include the note or did I not? Dalton Trumbo was one of the people. He was one of the Hollywood 10 who was like the people during the
Red Scare.
Yes, who was brought, or he refused to go and testify in front of Congress because he literally just was a communist. It was like, fuck you. Like, I don't, yeah. Anyways, I might have a note about that later. If we get to it. So eventually, RKO studio chief, the RKO studio chief urged Frank Capra to read The Greatest Gift, and Capra immediately thought, like, this is great, and wanted to make it as his first Hollywood film after he had been making movies again, because he had made movies before, but his first big re-entrance into Hollywood after he had been making films for the war, basically, like training, documentaries and training, war effort films. And thought this would be like his one to come back and make a big hit out of. And so RKO sold Capra the rights for $10,000 and apparently threw in the 3 earlier scripts. But according to Capra, he said no, actually he paid $50,000 for the rights in the scripts. Doesn't really matter. Eventually he got the rights for it. But he also got the older scripts, and apparently a few of the scenes in his version are salvaged from Odette's earlier screenplay. But then Capra would go on to work with several writers, including Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett, who I mentioned earlier, but also Joe Swirling, Michael Wilson, and Dorothy Parker, who were all brought in to what?
Dorothy Parker?
I don't know, who is that?
A writer. She had, I read her in like my lit classes.
Oh, okay. I was like, I don't know. Yeah. The name didn't ring a bell to me, so I wasn't sure. But they were all brought in to polish the script. And there was a ton of drafts of the screenplay. And supposedly Capra and the writers did not get along, specifically Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett. Goodrich called Capra, quote, that horrid man, and recalled, quote, he couldn't wait to get writing it himself. And Albert said, quote, we told him what we were going to do, and he said, that sounds fine. We were trying to move the story along and work it out, and then somebody told us that Capra and Joe Swirling were working on it together. And that sort of took the guts out of it. Joe Swirling was a very close friend of ours, and when we heard he was doing this, we felt rather bad about it. We were getting near the end, and word came that Capra wanted to know how soon we'd be finished. So my wife said, we're finished right now. We quickly wrote out the last scene, and we never saw him again after that. He's a very arrogant son of a bitch, end quote. Later, a dispute would ensue over the writing credits because so many people worked on it. The final screenplay, renamed by Capra, It's a Wonderful Life instead of The Greatest Gift, was credited to Goodrich, Hackett, and Capra, with additional scenes credited to Joe Swirling. Capra said, quote, the Screenwriters Arbitration Committee decided that Hackett and Goodrich and I should get the credit for the writing. Joe Swirling hasn't talked to me since. That was 5 years ago, end quote. So apparently just a nightmare writing this thing. It turned into a big scene. I thought this is really interesting. So, Seneca Falls, New York, has claimed for a long time that Capra was inspired to model Bedford Falls, the setting of the film, after Seneca Falls, after he visited there in 1945. The town has an annual It's a Wonderful Life festival every December, and in 2009, the Hotel Clarence opened in the town, named after George Bailey's guardian angel. And in 2010, It's a Wonderful Life Museum opened in the town with Carolyn Grimes, who played Zuzu in the movie, cutting the ribbon. However, film historian Janine Basinger, who curates the Frank Capra archives at Wesleyan University and literally wrote the book on It's a Wonderful Life, said, quote, there's no evidence whatsoever that exists for Seneca Falls claims. I have been through every piece of paper in Frank Capra's diaries, his archives, everything. There's no evidence of any sort whatsoever to support this. That doesn't mean it isn't true, but no one is ever going to prove it. And Basinger has said that Capra always described Bedford Falls as in every town. So according to the person who literally wrote the book on this movie, there's not actual concrete evidence that Bedford or Seneca Falls is what Bedford was based on, but they claim it anyways because it's making that money.
Yeah. That tourism.
Yes. So getting into some casting notes here, which I thought were fun. In his autobiography, Capra said, quote, "Of all actors' roles, I believe the most difficult is the role of a good Sam who doesn't know that he is a good Sam. I knew one man who could play it, James Stewart. I spoke to Lou Wasserman, the MCA agent who handled Jimmy, told him I wanted to tell Jimmy the story. Wasserman said Stewart would gladly play the part without hearing the story." The two of them had worked together. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, obviously, famously, and at least one other film. They'd worked together before. He was like, yes, I'll do it. So several other actresses were considered for the role of Mary, his wife, but probably most famously, Ginger Rogers was considered for the role, but turned it down, which eventually led to RKO borrowing, because this is back in the day where actors were tied to studios.
Yeah.
They had contracts with studios, and basically it was a big mess. And so RKO borrowed Donna Reed from MGM to play Mary, and Rogers went on to say that she turned down the role because she found it too bland.
I mean, she's
It's
not wrong.
But in her autobiography, she would question this decision by asking the readers, "Foolish, you say?" I was like, yeah, I mean, probably some.
I don't know. You're still Ginger Rogers.
Yeah, you're doing all right. There was a bunch of other actors considered for the role of Mr. Potter, but the one that I thought was most interesting was Vincent Price, which I thought
That is interesting.
Yeah.
That's a very different villain vibe than what they went with.
Yeah. I think we have actually mentioned this actor, I don't know the word for an animal actor before, but when we talked about probably Homeward Bound maybe or something, when we talked about animals in movies, I would think.
I think that was Babe.
Or Babe?
Yeah, when we talked about animals.
One
in
of them we
movies.
talked about animals in movies. I believe we mentioned Jimmy the Raven, who is Uncle Billy's pet in this film and appeared in You Can't Take It With You and every subsequent Capra film after that. And over the course of Jimmy the Raven's career was in more than 1,000 feature films from the 30s to the 50s, lived to be like 23 years old or whatever. And Jimmy received a Red Cross Gold Medal in acknowledgement for over 200 hours spent entertaining veterans after World War II.
Wow.
Also, his footprints were enshrined in cement at a large Los Angeles pet store alongside Lassie and other Hollywood animal stars.
Oh, I bet he loved that.
All right. So It's a Wonderful Life was shot at RKO Radio Picture Studios in Culver City, California, on their giant movie ranch in Encino. And Bedford Falls was adapted apparently from the Oscar-winning set originally designed for the 1931 film Cimarron, which looked to be a Western of some sort, which is weird. I don't know. At least from I literally only looked at the poster when I clicked on it, and it looked like a Western, but it's hard to tell.
It sounds like a Western.
Yeah. It says a 1931 epic film, which could mean lots of things. I don't know, but anyways, so the town covered 4 acres on the lot, and it consists of a main street stretching about 300 yards, which is roughly 3 city blocks, had 75 stores and buildings and a residential neighborhood. And then Capra would add on a tree-lined center parkway, which you see in the film quite a bit, a working bank set, and planted like 20 full-grown oak trees around the set to fill things in. Also, pigeons, cats, and dogs were allowed to roam the set to give the town a lived-in feel.
That's incredible. I bet everybody loved that.
Yeah, right?
I bet about half of them really loved it and half of them really hated it.
Yes. So getting into the IMDb trivia facts now. So again, take these all with a grain of salt, but who knows? I'm sure this is one of those movies that's fairly well documented, so I'm sure a lot of this is true to some extent. So there's a scene where Donna Reed, Mary, throws a rock through a window of the Granville house, and on the day, Capra had hired a sharpshooter or a rifleman to shoot out the window basically when she threw the rock. But apparently Donna Reed has a cannon for an arm because she played baseball in high school, and she threw the rock and broke the window herself. So they didn't need the person to shoot out the window.
I hope that one's true.
I know, I agree. There's another scene where Uncle Billy leaves the Bailey home drunk, and you hear him stumble into some trash cans on the sidewalk. And apparently what actually happened was that during filming, a crew member dropped a bunch of a bunch of props on a tray right after he went off screen. And Jimmy Stewart started laughing, and Mitchell improvised saying like, "I'm all right, I'm okay." after the noise or whatever, and Frank Capra liked it so much that he left it in and then gave the stagehand a $10 bonus for, quote, improvising the sound. So there's a scene where the gym floor opens up in the middle of the dance or whatever to reveal a swimming pool underneath, and this was filmed at Beverly Hills High School in Beverly Hills, California. It's real, and it's still in use when this fact was written. It was in another film in 2005 or 6 doing like the same thing, and so it was still usable like 55 years later or whatever. I don't know if it's still in use.
That gym floor that opens up and there's a pool underneath, one of the wildest things I'd seen as like a 6-year-old.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So prior to this film, the primary way of creating fake snow in film apparently was to use cornflakes painted white and then drop them. But cornflakes, when they fell, were very loud, so dialogue would all be 80 yards later, basically, because you would have too much noise from the cornflakes falling. It also seems, anyways, I don't know.
It
this
seems
is, again,
like they're too heavy. Like they wouldn't fall right.
This is what it says. But Capra wanted live sound. He didn't want to do it all ADR. He wanted live sound on the set that they could use. So they created a new snow effect, and it was developed by using foamite, which is a firefighting chemical, soap, and water. And then this was pumped into a wind machine, basically, to create the fake snow, which is also very similar to how they do snow now, which is basically like foam. A lot of times,
just like blow foam, right?
Essentially, there's different ways, but that is one of the main ways you see a lot. I noticed it when we were watching the latest episode of Abbott Elementary. I was like, that looks like foam snow.
Yeah,
like it looks, it's convincing enough, but you can tell it kind of looks like foam. And so I doubt they use foamite or whatever anymore. There's probably a better, like, less quote unquote chemically way to do it these days, but anyways, they actually won an award, a technical an Academy Award for like technical whatever for inventing this new way to do fake snow in movies. So getting back to why this film became a classic, as we discussed earlier, the copyright stuff. After Paramount bought Liberty Films, which was Capra's studio, in the 50s, the rights moved around a little bit between Paramount and then eventually National Telefilm Associates, NTA, got the rights later. And then in 1974, a clerical error prevented National Telefilm Associates from renewing the copyright. When that happened, the film lapsed into public domain for a spell, and during that time, in the 70s and 80s, TV stations started playing the film like crazy.
Yeah.
Now, the wiki has conflicting reports on whether or not those stations had to pay royalties, with the article stating at the beginning that they didn't. In the opening paragraph of the Wikipedia article, it says that the reason it became popular is because the copyright lapsed, TV stations played it because they didn't have to pay royalties. But then in the section later, specifically about this part, it says that the film was considered, that because it was based on The Greatest Gift, it was still under copyright because it was a derivative work, and they basically had to pay copyright to, as you kind of mentioned, to the author because it's based on the book. And so I don't know what I didn't do enough reading to kind of get into the exact truth of how that all breaking down. I'm sure it's complicated. Either way, it would appear that the copyright issue led to wide television play, and that led to the film's subsequent rise in fame, and it's, becoming a Christmas classic, a Christmas staple. My guess is that maybe, even though they still had to pay royalties, maybe it was less than had.
Oh, I'm sure it
you know
would
what I
have
mean?
been
Like
less,
paying the royalties for the derivative work to the author or whatever was far less than maybe if you were paying Paramount or whatever, whoever whoever would have had the rights, had the or National Telefilm Associates or whatever, had they had the film rights still. So it was probably cheaper or something, and so that whatever. Again, kind of conflicting reports on the Wikipedia article, but the copyright issue led to it getting a lot of TV play, which is why it became such a big hit. Because upon its release, the film got mixed reviews. Time said, quote, "It's a Wonderful Life is a pretty wonderful movie. It has only one formidable rival. Goldwyn's The Best Years of Our Lives." So this Time didn't think it was the long weekend or the last weekend or whatever. But it has only one formidable rival, The Best Years of Our Lives, as Hollywood's best picture of the year. Director Capra's inventiveness, humor, and affection for human beings keeps it glowing with life and excitement. On the other hand, so that was one of the more positive reviews. On the other hand, Bosley Crowther, writing for the New York Times, complimented some of the actors, including Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed, but ultimately concluded, quote, the weakness of this picture from this reviewer's point of view, somebody should have told him you don't have to say that. The weakness of this review in this reviewer's point of view is that you said this reviewer's point of view. Getting back to the review. Anyways, quote, the weakness of this picture from this reviewer's point of view is the sentimentality of it. Its illusory concept of life. Mr. Capra's nice people are charming. His small town is a quite beguiling place, and his pattern for solving problems is most optimistic and facile. But somehow they all resemble theatrical attitudes rather than average realities. So basically, boil down to like, yeah, it's great, but it's a little like that's not how life works.
What's interesting is I wonder, because this came out directly post-war, if we're seeing like the kind of divide of people who wanted to look at that like escapism and like look at the bright side, and
versus
this is like, versus people who have been like disillusioned.
I think that could be very very probably what is going on here. So I gotta get this because this is one of my favorite notes. I mentioned earlier that Trumbo, who wrote on a script or an element of the script at one point, he was one of the Hollywood 10 who was called, one of the people, McCarthy. No, that would have been later. Whatever. The big Red Scare thing in the 50s. Who was called before Congress and blah, 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 and didn't go. On May 26, 1947, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, issued a memo stating, quote, with regard to the picture, It's a Wonderful Life, redacted, stated in substance that the film represented rather obvious attempts to discredit bankers by casting Lionel Barrymore as a Scrooge type so that he would be the most hated man in the picture. This, according to these sources, is a common trick used by communists. In addition, Redacted stated that, in his opinion, this picture deliberately maligned the upper class, attempting to show that people who had money were mean and despicable characters. End quote.
One, that's amazing.
I love it.
Two, what is funny?
The FBI was like, our assessment is this movie is based.
What is funny about that is that for as capitalist as Christmas is, shitting on capitalism is also kind of a grand Christmas tradition.
Yeah. I mean, it's arguably two of the most famous Christmas films of all time are literally just huge indictments of capitalism. Like, it's very funny, if not more. But like two of the most striking examples. That cracked me up. FBI put out a statement. This movie's communist. Okay, great. In 1990, It's a Wonderful Life was deemed culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant by the Library of Congress and was selected for preservation on the National Film Registry, which should not be a surprise to anybody. And my last note, which I thought was very fun, Orson Welles, famously critical of many films, most films maybe, other than his own, and even his own to some extent, I guess, played Mr. Potter in the made-for-television remake of The Greatest Gift, It Happened One Christmas. And when asked by Henry Jaglom, I guess a journalist or something, what he thought of It's a Wonderful Life, Orson Welles said, quote, "There's no way of hating that movie," end quote, which I thought was interesting because Orson Welles seems like he could hate anything, in my opinion.
Yeah, for real.
From what I've seen of the man, and he's a talented individual, or was, obviously, but it seemed like he could find a way to hate almost anything, so I thought that was kind of fun. As always, you can do us a giant favor by following us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Goodreads, any of those places. Leave us comments, leave us feedback. We'll read them like we just did in this episode, talk about them, all that good stuff. Also support us on Patreon, patreon.com/thisfilmislit. We really appreciate it. Katie, where can people watch It's a Wonderful Life?
Well, as always, you can check with your local library. You might want to get on that. I imagine this is a popular one at this time of year.
Although, who needs to rent it? Just turn on.
True.
I say turn on your TV. Nobody has cable
Or a local video rental store if
Yeah.
you still have one. Or if you're around our age, your parents probably have a copy of
Yeah.
it.
Or if you have TV for some reason still, like
Yeah,
actually
you could probably
cable, or
search it on
you can
cable
probably
and find it
Yeah.
playing somewhere. But if nothing else, you can stream this with a subscription through Amazon Prime, Plex, or Hoopla. Or you can rent it for around $3 to $4 through Amazon, YouTube, Vudu, Redbox, Apple TV, or AMC Theaters on Demand.
There you go. It's a Wonderful Life. I'm actually looking for, because again, we talked about it. I don't know if I've ever seen this movie front to back. If I do, I have, I don't recall seeing it front to back. So I'm interested to see what I think of it, because it's, it's famous for a reason.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
we'll be talking about that in 1 week's time. Come back right before Christmas for our episode on It's a Wonderful Life. Until that time, guys, gals, non-binary pals, and everybody else,
Keep reading books
keep watching movies
and keep being awesome.